Hello and welcome to the Week in 60 Minutes, brought to you by SpectatorTV and broadcast on Thursday, November 11th. I'm Kate Andrews, the Spectator's economics editor and your host this week. On this week's show, what started as a lobbying row with Tory MP Owen Paterson has become a wider crisis for the Prime Minister. MPs with second jobs are in the firing line, and the Tories have been accused of offering peerages for cash. Fraser Nelson says the government is in turmoil in this week's cover piece, and he'll join us alongside our deputy political editor Katy Balls and former number 10 Chief of Staff Gavin Barwell. Douglas Murray, meanwhile, argues in his column this week that MPs have less power over Parliament than they should have. He'll be on to make his case. And we've managed to ignore it for a while, but Brexit is back. Britain is threatening to tear up the Northern Ireland Protocol. Are we looking at a trade war with Europe? We'll speak to the former UK representative to the EU, Ivan Rogers, alongside our political editor, James Forsyth. Then we'll turn to China and America. Are we about to see a war over Taiwan? Elbridge Colby, a former Donald Trump defense advisor, says Taiwan is crucial to making sure China doesn't come to dominate Asia. He'll tell us why he thinks America needs to get ready for conflict. After that, we'll hear from Emma Ashford, an expert who disagrees and says Washington is getting hysterical. And we'll finish by speaking to Israel's ambassador to the UK. She attended a debate at LSE earlier this week and was met by fierce protests when she tried to leave. Why do people want her silenced? Before we get going, if you enjoy Spectator TV, then you should subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just click the red button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon to make sure you never miss an episode. And why not subscribe to the Spectator's magazine too? You can get 12 weeks of the magazine and a free £20 Amazon voucher for just £12. To take up the deal, go to spectator.co.uk/TV offer. Now, Owen Paterson quit as an MP last week after he was found to have broken lobbying rules, and it was recommended he be suspended from the Commons for 30 days. Wanting to help out a fellow Tory, the Prime Minister planned to change the entire system and overturn the ruling. Then he backtracked. Now, a week later, the row has morphed into a crisis for the government over MPs' second jobs and the Conservatives allegedly offering a seat in the House of Lords for donations to the party. In his cover piece this week, Fraser Nelson says the mess is indicative of the court of chaos that surrounds Boris Johnson. How did he not see this coming? Fraser joins me now with Katy Balls and Gavin Barwell, former Chief of Staff to Theresa May and author of Chief of Staff Notes from Downing Street. Fraser, you write this week that in Boris's court, he may be king, but he's losing his grip. Tell us about what's going on in number 10.
Well, it's actually a bit of a mystery what is going on in number 10. Why, for example, last week did they think it was right to lead the troops into battle over Owen Paterson, only to reverse when they realised that they were on a mission impossible from the get-go? But the funny thing is, we spoke about this in last week's Spectator TV, but since then you're getting increasing noises of disgruntlement from the Tory benches, who basically think that the constant U-turns, the constant panic, shows number 10, which is fundamentally dysfunctional. Now, for my cover piece, I spoke to a lot of people who know what's going on there in and around the Prime Minister. And having somebody, in a way, I suppose I follow in Boris Johnson's footsteps. He was a hugely successful editor of this magazine, a very successful mayor of London. I always argue to be a very successful Prime Minister as well. And not because he was a sort of great command and control guy, but because he built around him an apparatus where people who he liked and trusted would be able to distinguish his great ideas from the acts of occasional lunacy, and they would be able to differentiate. I mean, Stuart Reid, the deputy editor, did that at the Spectator. At City Hall, he had something like 12 deputy mayors who he devolved power to, who were able to understand him and also interpret him, if you like. As Foreign Secretary, he couldn't appoint anybody. He was a flop in that position, I'm afraid to say. And then number 10, you'd think he'd getting it right. You'd think he'd find somebody who he trusted. The problem was that he got Dominic Cummings. Now, Dominic Cummings was quite competent, but as we now know, he was running an agenda separate to that of the Prime Minister in a way that was designed to exclude the Prime Minister from the decision-making process, or a large part of it, in number 10. So number 10 is overcorrected from being a machine where what the Prime Minister wants is of peripheral interest to being a machine where even his bad ideas get enacted. So you remember, Kate, in lockdown, when Boris got pinged, He thought he'd give himself an exemption and not self-isolate in the way that hundreds of thousands of others were having to self-isolate. Now, you should have had an advisor there saying, Boris, that's obviously a mad idea. Of course, you need to lead by example. You cannot possibly get yourself out of this jail that you've created for other people. But no, it went forward and it led to a public uproar, and then only then did the U-turn come. So we're seeing a dysfunctional number 10, more of a court, I argue, than a government, and full of people who aren't really telling him the truth. The truth right now is that things are pretty bad and are going to get worse. And instead he's being told it's okay, it's all a bit of Westminster gossip, you can carry on. In fact, his approval rating is now down to -26, a new low for him, and the opinion poll lead over Labour has evaporated, so there is, I'm afraid to say, a lot more downside to come.
Katie, as Fraser's getting out there, the Prime Minister, when he first came into Downing Street, was surrounded by very strong advisors. Some might say too strong. Now it seems that he's surrounded by yes men, whose role is to enact whatever the king decrees. Is this an overcorrection that we're witnessing?
Yeah, I think we can see a shift between two systems, and around the time that Dominic Cummings left alongside Lee Kane, other members of the Vote Leave team, I remember writing a cover piece for the Spectator where ultimately lots of people, including ministers, are saying, let Boris be Boris. He's been too strained in, there's been an attempt to box him in, and actually where the Prime Minister really excels is getting out there, speaking more, going about doing the things he wants to do rather than going this tight script and quite a defensive approach by the Vote Leave team. I think that you can agree with some of that criticism and then look what's happening now, and it's almost so Boris Johnson at the moment. Even if you look back to Tory conference, the leader's speech, it was very much Boris Johnson's greatest hits, playing to the crowd, very light, lots of jokes, and you can see on one hand why we got that, because it was the first annual meet since the election victory, given that the last time it had to be cancelled. But it's also the case that someone said, is this really, appropriate? Should there be a bit more warning people about quite tricky months ahead? And I think that you see it with the Owen Paterson affair in the sense that the fact that Boris Johnson thought he could push through with this and no one really stopped him, and those who did stop him said, we'd said it to him but he didn't listen, that there's almost a loss of the checks and controls. So it's not to say you should go back to how it was a year ago, but it definitely feels as though you're going between extremes.
Gavin, there are different ways of running number 10. Under Blair, the cabinet had less influence, at least say compared to someone like David Cameron, who often let his ministers get on with their briefs. Under Theresa May, you had strong advisors, again, like Nick Timothy, Fiona Hill. We can throw yourself into the mix. Is Boris Johnson, do you think, just being managed particularly badly, or is the system itself flawed?
So I think first of all, you're right that there's no identical way to run number 10. That you've got to get a structure that works for whoever the Prime Minister is. But it's not a question of Boris being managed badly. He himself has got to take responsibility for the structure he sets around him. And as Fraser was saying, this is not a one-off. The Paterson affair was the worst example. But if you look at the number of U-turns that we've had from the government, that shouldn't be happening when you've got a majority of 80. So this is not a one-off incident. I think that's what's worrying Conservative MPs, that they're seeing repeated instances of where the government digs itself into a position which is clearly untenable and then has to sort of scramble out of it. Now, what's made this particular case so damaging for the Prime Minister standing within the parliamentary party is, first of all, that it was so obviously a mistake. I mean, it didn't take long for this one to play out, essentially. The moment the government said it was going to back the Leadsom Amendment, people were predicting, well, hang on, the opposition is just not going to take the seats on the committee and then the whole thing is going to blow up. And secondly, it's obviously had huge impact on Conservative MPs themselves, both in terms of the feedback they've had from constituents, but then the story has clearly moved on to some of the second jobs that a number of those MPs have. So it's not, I think, a question that the Prime Minister has been badly managed. He himself needs to take responsibility for the operation he has around him. And that means, either there isn't anyone that told him this was a bad idea, or if there is, they're not people whose judgment he is accepting. And he's got to find someone. I thought Fraser's example of City Hall was a really good one. You first of all had Simon Milton, then you had Eddie Lister, two people who he clearly trusted, whose judgment he clearly trusted and who he listened to. And he needs to make sure that he's got someone around him in number 10 that has the confidence to say to him when he's making a serious mistake and whose judgment he is going to trust.
Katie, do you think Boris is ready or willing to accept change to the system in Downing Street? And are Tory MPs telling him that the way things are running simply isn't working?
So Tory MPs are fed up after the past week or so. The Owen Paterson affair, I think, has ultimately confirmed quite a few of the fears they had about the operation. I also think it's the case that and Fraser's been covering politics longer than me, but I've never covered a Prime Minister where Tory MPs are delighted with everything they do. Maybe the day after a big election victory, but there's always going to be some complaints, and therefore, it's often what you hear is number 10 has too much power. I think that there is a growing sense, though, that the flip-flopping, the U-turns, the changing of the decisions means that, you keep hearing Tory MPs saying, he needs an old hand, he needs a senior figure. And as Fraser writes in his cover piece, Eddie Lister perhaps been trying to tempt him back, but perhaps not something that he was particularly keen on, former close aide. The fact that Ben Gascoigne from the City Hall group is returning as a deputy chief of staff. You are seeing some personnel changes, but I do think that the problem is, given there is dysfunction for some time now, is questions of what is the answer to that? Is it a senior, older figure? Or does ultimately Boris Johnson need to reassess how he governs? And maybe it's a decision by him, as Gavin was touching on, to actually listen to some of the people he already has there. Because there's enough people briefing out or getting friends to brief out that they warned against this. Just as you heard with the self-isolation route, you say, oh no, I said this is a bad idea. So maybe their voices need to be a bit louder, and also the Prime Minister needs to accept that actually sometimes to be a good Prime Minister you have to listen to advice you don't want to hear and act on it.
And Fraser, you mentioned in your cover piece that perhaps the solution to this, or at least the start of one, is that Boris should think about running a government instead of a court.
Yes, and recognise that the current setup isn't working for him, let alone the party, let alone the country. This is not... the Boris Johnson we're seeing now looks a far less impressive figure than the one that we saw as city mayor. The city mayor did not make these massive U-turns, did not let these mad ideas take the wind so often, and he needs to work out why that is. And part of it is personal. He actually finds it rather difficult to trust people individually. Gavin will know more about this, but I think the same was true for Theresa May. She wasn't a particularly gregarious person and didn't have around her many people whom you trust. I guess that's true for most of us, really. How many people would you really, to have a chief of staff? We're talking somebody you'd have to pretty much trust with your political life. How many of us know somebody who we completely trust, their instincts, and to take the decisions that we would, or rather the better parts of ourselves, would take it? It's very difficult to do. But it's so important for a Prime Minister to find somebody like that, to find a Willie Whitelaw, to find a David Wilson, to find a Charles Powell in Tony Blair's case. And for Boris Johnson, it's absolutely crucial. When he became Tory party leader, I remember writing a column thinking, well, it is unless he can find his Stuart Reid, his deputy editor, his liege, this will not be a successful project. He absolutely needs somebody like that. And maybe because Dominic Cummings let him down so spectacularly, he feels a bit stung there and thinks, well, maybe I'm going to just to try to keep on and just keep things in my head, to just not really let people in. But no, anybody who has worked with Boris Johnson, and I know a lot of people who have worked very closely with him over the years, will tell you he absolutely needs somebody by his side to be his interface with the rest of the world. He's an incredibly private person. He doesn't really take people into his confidence. It's very difficult to find out what he's thinking, even if you're trying to work out what broad direction he's going in. He takes even his closest aides by surprise so far, quite often. And he says contradictory things, almost as if he's trying to... The way he thinks, he argues both sides of it out aloud. So if you listen to him, you're not quite sure which side of your argument is coming down on. So he does need to find somebody to succeed Dominic Cummings. He needs that pretty urgently, I'd say, because there are some laws of gravity, political gravity, you can't defy for very much longer. keep on governing like this, you will lose your reputation for competence. He's already lost his reputation for cutting low taxes, and soon he might lose his popularity, and after that he better be careful, because the Tory party won't put up with him if they think he's become a liability.
So Gavin, how does the Prime Minister decide who to trust?
It's a really good question. I mean, normally the person that you would appoint into that kind of role is someone you have known for a long time, for exactly the reasons Fraser said. So if you think about my predecessors, Nick Timothy and Fiona Hill, Theresa had a very long-standing relationship with them. So my appointment was really a sort of exception to the rule, as it were, because we didn't know each other very well. And she took a big risk asking me to do the job, because we kind of had to learn how to work together while, on the job, essentially. I had to get to know her very quickly in order that as Chief of Staff, I understood her mind and could speak to senior ministers and officials about what it was that she wanted to do. And, essentially, sometimes as Chief of Staff, you function a little bit like the Oracle at Delphi. People don't want to bother the PM at the weekend necessarily, but they come to you saying, I'm thinking of doing this, what would the PM think? So that if he hasn't got someone who's close to him already that he has in mind for the job, he is going to have to take a punt on finding someone who he believes he can develop that relationship with. And as Fraser said, it isn't easy. It's an important choice to make, but he should, I think, have learnt the lesson over the last few weeks that this is something that he desperately needs. And I completely agree with what Fraser said. For the moment, forget the government or the Tory party, the current structure isn't working for him. And it is his own personal interest, let alone the party's interest or the government's interest, to put that right.
Katy, last word to you. It's quite clear that he's going to have to change direction. But arguably he's in a tough spot. He's already gone through a lot of his former colleagues who he might call into the role.
Yeah, it's interesting when Gavin's talking about how, if it's not someone you immediately have that relationship with already, you've got to take a punt. Well, you could say it's what the Prime Minister did with Dan Rosenfield. And by all accounts, as much as Dan Rosenfield is still in position, the fact that these things are happening when he is Chief of Staff, we're hearing Dan Rosenfield said that, he shouldn't press on with this Owen Paterson plan. And that was briefed out. And on reading those reports and, hearing from others that this was the case, that Dan Rosenfield wasn't on board, you couldn't help but think, is this actually a helpful briefing for Dan Rosenfield? Because for me, it's just confirming that as Chief of Staff, he doesn't really have the Prime Minister's ear. And I think that's problematic. So in terms of where you can look, obviously you can go to old people you trust. But given that the Prime Minister's fallen out with some of those people, others are looking at Downing Street and thinking perhaps the more quiet, peaceful life is not there, is a tough one. And that's why I do think as much as he does need a senior figure, you've also got to think, what can he work with in the immediate and medium term? You have Nigel Adams, that is an old-timer, old retainer MP, close to Boris Johnson, supported him for his different leadership campaigns, who was promoted in the cabinet reshuffle to a role which no one quite fully understands, but has something to do with obviously acting as a go-between Boris Johnson and the Parliamentary Party. And I do wonder if looking at his long-time supporters, you can find a few people like that who come together and make a difference.
Fraser, Katy and Gavin, thanks for joining Spectator TV. It might sound like there's not enough oversight of MPs, but in his column this week, Douglas Murray says unelected officials have the real power. To explain, Douglas joins me now alongside James Forsyth. Douglas, thanks again for joining us on Spectator TV. You write in your column that the most boring conversation in the nation is back. What is it exactly?
Yes, Lord's reform. Who doesn't quiver slightly when they just hear those words. Lord's reform is one of the most boring conversations in Britain because it's essentially unsolvable, and it's happened and gone on throughout all of our lifetimes. Many of us remember the debates in the 1990s over this, particularly with getting the hereditaries down. Ever since then, there's been intermittent claims and calls for more reform. And the reason it's so tedious is because there really aren't any good options. Intermittently, people claim, well, just scrap the entire chamber. That's a terrible option because you do need a second chamber to revise legislation. Every way you look at how it should be made up, you enter all sorts of trouble. And then you get the one which we're in at the moment, which is the perennial cash for peerages debate. And, this is serious because we all worry about the way in which money influences politics. It's I think that in many ways Britain is lucky that we have less buying of influence than many other democracies, actually. But the peerages issue is always going to be a strong one because effectively, if you don't have state-funded political parties, and political parties need to raise money through private donors and trade unions in the case of Labour, people are going to have to be given some incentive to give millions of pounds to a political party simply through the good of your heart or through something else. It is a strange thing to do. Not very many people would do it. So there need to be inducements. There are going to be inducements. And one of them, and it's an open secret, is that if you give enough money to a political party, you may find yourself able to be suggested as being a potential peer. It's not a great system at all. I don't like it any more than anyone else. But as I say, what are the other options?
James, it hasn't been a good week for the government, has it? Can you give us the latest update with Owen Paterson, Geoffrey Cox, and the cash for peerages story?
Yeah, the government has basically created a scandal that has run all week and I think is beginning to do real damage to the Tory party. Its actions in trying to stay the guilty verdict against Owen Paterson and then kind of trying to reform the rules on the back of that was so brazen it has created a backlash. It has got everyone looking at MPs' second jobs, and it has put Boris Johnson in a very difficult position. He's having to choose whether to be on the right side of public opinion or the right side of his own MPs, because I think if you're judging from what MPs say they're getting in their inboxes, there's no doubt that most of the public question why MPs need to have the ability to earn money other than their £82,000 a year parliamentary salary. Yet, at the same time, Tory MPs, and particularly more traditional Tory MPs, think, they have these outside interests which they are reluctant to give up. And they also think, and I think this is not an invalid point, that if you basically bar MPs from doing any other work other than their parliamentary work, you are going to limit Parliament to those who wish to be professional politicians, and you are going to end, the ranks of kind of QC MPs that you had. People like Ken Clarke or Michael Howard, and I think that would narrow the experience available to Parliament, and I think it would denude Parliament of quality. I think one of the problems we've already got at the moment is that there is a tendency for, and Theresa May is an honourable exception to this, there's a tendency for former prime ministers to kind of quit the Commons as soon as they've left office. I think if you banned all outside interests, I think you would find that nearly all former cabinet ministers quit the Commons as soon as they have left office.
Douglas, you wonder in your column this week whether trying to reform the Lords and the Commons misses a crucial point. Do our representatives even have that much power in Parliament anymore?
Yes, this is something which I've been reflecting on for a long time, as I mentioned, not just in relation to the House of Lords, but the House of Commons as well. Remember one of the main slogan of the Brexiteers was "Take back control," and I say in my column this week, when the British public voted to take back control from unelected bureaucrats in Brussels, I do not think that we intended to take back that control and give it to unelected bureaucrats in Westminster. And this is a subject which, as James well knows, has been bubbling for a long time among both MPs and peers about who actually has primacy in their own houses. Now, it seems to me, without going into the details of it, it seems to me that the Owen Paterson affair has an awful lot that it suggests about our democracy not functioning well. I believe that the oversight that occurred was seriously lacking, basically what occurred would have been impossible in a judicial setup. Owen Paterson effectively wanted his day in court, was not given it, partly because the person who was judging him is not a judge. She's an absolutely typical archetypal bureaucrat. And and there was so much wrong in her investigation. But then you end up in this position, of course, which was made much worse by the ridiculous U-turning of the Boris Johnson government. I mean, if you're going to spend political capital, as they were going to do, spend it and see it through. Don't spend it and then U-turn at the first cries of complaint. But the real thing is not just the oversight of MPs and the oversight of MPs' extracurricular or extra activities, but also in the House of Lords.
James, Douglas is pointing out here that he thinks that the oversight mechanisms currently in place can sometimes be too powerful. That's certainly something the allies of Owen Paterson have been saying these past few weeks. On the flip side, of course, especially in light of the Geoffrey Cox revelations, you have people saying that there simply hasn't been enough oversight. But it feels to me like we're getting to a far broader point here, and perhaps a more crucial one, which is, what is the job of an MP? And how much time and dedication should be put into that craft as opposed to other kinds of work?
So I personally think that having MPs who carry on with their former professions and trades while they are backbench MPs can be healthy. For example, just constitutionally, we have an Attorney General and a Solicitor General in our system and an Advocate General for Scotland. They all need to be lawyers. So you do need a certain number of lawyers to be practicing in the House of Commons. And, I think, Michael Howard and Ken Clarke are examples of the fact that you can combine a successful legal career at the bar with a successful parliamentary and political career. And that, I think, is healthy. I think where things become more dubious is when MPs are being paid for kind of political intelligence or things like that, rather than for carrying on with the jobs that they were doing. But I also think we have to make choices as a country. I think we lament the fact that there are so many professional politicians in the House of Commons. We lament the fact that there are so many, if one was being unkind, kind of super councillors in the House of Commons. If you don't want to have that, then you are going to need to allow us to have a system that does allow people to not to have to entirely give up their previous careers when they become politicians. And I think that is striking that balance. Now, I think you can get into specific arguments about how long people should be away or not. And I think the fact that Geoffrey Cox has spoken so little in the House of Commons in recent times doesn't do him any favours. But theoretically, I have no issue with someone being a QC and carrying on earning more from their legal practice than they do as a backbench MP, as long as they are speaking and participating in debates and generally raising the tone of scrutiny of legislation in the House of Commons. And I think this argument applies even more forcefully to the House of Lords. If you are to hugely restrict what Lords can do, then I think far fewer people will enter the House of Lords, because the dirty secret about the House of Lords is that the House of Lords doesn't have very much power, and the House of Lords will never be reformed, because the House of Commons does not want the House of Lords to be reformed in a way, because if the House of Lords was reformed, it would have to be given more power. It would have to be more of a check on the House of Commons than it currently is, and the House of Commons doesn't want that.
Can I just add one point? I agree with what James says, but there's one point that's very important here, which is that the example he cites of lawyers having, as it were, continuing their careers is a pertinent one, and also it needs to be caveated. It cannot be the case that the Commons is filled with full-time MPs and part-time MPs who are also part-time lawyers. And I say that because it cannot be the case that only practicing lawyers continue to practice in the Commons. Because we can't have, in my view, an ever-increasing legalisation of the political class. One of the things that the Commons needs is voices representing all sorts of different opinions, including opinions that have nothing to do with the legality of questions, but respond to the constituents' concerns about issues. All sorts of areas of our country have nothing to do with the law, but have things to do with everyday concerns of people. So as I say, there shouldn't be a sort of super MP who is also a practicing lawyer. But it is tricky terrain. as we know. I think that there are good rules in place regarding, as James says, sort of the really dodgy areas like political consultancy. But this has to be said because. And I'd add one other thing, by the way, which is James is totally right about this complete confusion among us in the general public on these issues of MPs and MPs' pay. We say we don't want professional politicians, but we don't like people from other professions either. We say that we want people to go into politics with a wealth of experience, and then we expect them to completely cut off that experience when they get into politics. This gets back to something I think has been a problem in our country for a while, which is a sort of a desire, effectively, with some good cause, to sort of punish the political class, to catch the politicians, the MPs in particular, in a kind of vice between two things that are screwing towards them and are keeping them locked in place. I don't think it's healthy. It's not a particularly healthy instinct for us to have either as a public.
James, last word to you.
So I obviously, it shouldn't just be lawyers that you have in the House of Commons. You should have people from all walks of life. But I think that lawyers illustrate the problem with trying to have a kind of blanket ban on all outside interests, which I think is something that is going to gain traction as an idea following the way that the government has behaved in recent weeks. And the longer this scandal goes on, the more inclination there will be for the government to reach for some big dramatic thing to try and move the story on. And I think that would be a mistake. And so I think that is the problem we've got to deal with. I think we also need to work out that, I think that one of the crucial points that Douglas makes is Parliament has now had powers returned to it. And I think what we've got to see is that Parliament is prepared to use the powers it has had returned to it, and that Parliament is prepared to properly hold the executive to account, and Parliament is prepared to take more responsibility for its own affairs.
By the way, I know you said the last word to James, but can we just have a moment also to observe, like a minute's silence, the complete horlicks that this government is capable of making of absolutely everything. From the smallest scandal to the biggest. There is nothing that Number 10 at the moment doesn't seem to be capable of blowing up into a huge storm. It's quite remarkable to watch.
Douglas, thanks for joining me. And James, you're going to stay with us because we're moving on to Brexit. Britain is threatening to ditch the Northern Ireland Protocol, which governs trade between the UK, the island of Ireland, and the EU in our post-Brexit era. This is called triggering Article 16. The agreement says that if trade is being disrupted by the protocol, the EU and the UK have a right to suspend it by invoking this article. But the EU says this could put the entire Brexit deal in jeopardy, while the UK says that unless the protocol is made more favourable to Britain, it will be left with no other choice. Are we about to see a trade war? Ivan Rogers, formerly the UK's permanent representative to the EU, joins us now to discuss. Now, James, first to you. We haven't spoken about Brexit for quite a while. What's going on here?
So I think there is an expectation on the EU side that a UK trigger of Article 16 could come quite soon, maybe as soon as the COP summit in Glasgow has finished. I think what you saw when David Frost went to the House of Lords on Wednesday was an attempt to say, no, we are not triggering it imminently. This is not coming next week or anything like that. And I thought he took, this is obviously relative because David Frost is I think one of the most combative diplomats that I can remember. But he took a slightly more emollient tone than he normally does in the House of Lords about the EU, saying that the negotiations hadn't ended, they were still making some progress, it just wasn't anywhere near quick enough. We've also had a quite downbeat briefing to EU ambassadors in Brussels from Markus Sefcovic, the EU Commission Vice President, who is handling the Northern Ireland question. And so I think the question becomes, is the UK going to trigger Article 16? If it does trigger Article 16, will it attempt to do some kind of small tweaks using Article 16? Or will it attempt to use Article 16 to essentially rewrite the protocol to along the lines set out in the UK's command paper? And then the other question obviously becomes, how does the EU respond? We know that the French view is that there needs to be a pretty tough EU response. And I think there is quite a few member states who take the view that, you've got to show Britain that it's got to stick to its commitments. And so I think the question is whether you can make some progress in the coming weeks that allows the UK ideally to not trigger Article 16, but making that progress is going to require the UK pulling back from some of its negotiating objectives on things like the European Court of Justice, for example.
We'll come back to those objectives, but first, Ivan, who's really in the wrong here? Is it the EU's fault for forcing an unworkable solution on the UK, or is it the UK's fault for accepting it and thinking that it would fix things later?
Well, that probably would take longer to try and answer properly than we've got on this programme. So it's a very long, contorted history, mostly unhappy. I've never been a great fan of the protocol and obviously was deeply critical of the way the negotiation was run in 2017, 18, 19. So it doesn't surprise me that we're here. Look, I think the protocol as it currently stands has not been working well on the ground, and there are legitimate concerns being raised by the British and obviously by people in Northern Ireland that the thing doesn't work and isn't working as planned. And there are a set, I would hope, of reasonably pragmatic things, building on what the Commission's already proposed on October the 13th, which you could do, which would at least mitigate that and address some of the kind of worst concerns. I think, as James says, it goes beyond that, though. If you look at the command paper language from the UK in July, and indeed at David Frost's language in speeches subsequently, and in various other interventions and in the media, it isn't just a set of pragmatic, technical, technocratic considerations which can be smoothed away by further negotiation at the technocratic level. It's an identity and sovereignty issue. Now, as James says, I think if it becomes genuinely an issue where the British side says that we simply can't accept as expansive a scope of EU law operating in Northern Ireland, and therefore essentially the jurisdiction of the ECJ where EU law operates. And that was the basis of the protocol solution to this. If that's the position, then you're really demanding a rather fundamental rewrite of the protocol. And there, I think we're in deep trouble, because I don't think the EU is up for a fundamental negotiation of the protocol. I mean, there are lots of pros and cons of that as to whether they should be and who made what errors when in 2017 to 2019. But the reality now is they think that the British government under Boris Johnson ultimately signed off on and ratified and indeed proclaimed as a glorious negotiating triumph in January 2020 this protocol. And now they want to fundamentally reopen and rewrite it. So I think the EU side, it's not incidentally, I think there are even ways in which you could invoke Article 16, which would not be utterly inflammatory. And I think James is implying that. There are ways in which you could invoke Article 16, and that would simply create more pressure, but more space for a further negotiation, down in the weeds on the technical issues. But if the fundamental issue here is the operation, the subjection of Northern Ireland on trade and regulation issues to EU law, then it seems to me this is going to be insoluble, and then you're heading for a breakdown and heading for a trade war. But it crucially depends on, is there a bar which Frost and indeed Johnson can set, which they could in principle jump and then get enough to declare victory on? Or are the concerns so deep on the extent to which Northern Ireland is subject permanently to EU law and therefore may drift away further from Great Britain? If that's the issue, then I think we're heading for the rocks, probably.
Well, James, can we dig into those objectives a bit more? What are the red lines on both sides? What are the main things they're hoping to achieve? And are you optimistic that they'll be able to get there without something as extreme like Article 16 being triggered occurring?
So I think the EU's primary objective is the protection of the integrity of the single market, and so to that mind, they also want to avoid a border on the island of Ireland. So to that mind, you basically need to shift the border into the Irish Sea, which is what the protocol essentially does. It creates a trade boundary in the Irish Sea. I think the UK government's argument is, hang on a second, this is creating too much trade diversion, which is one of the reasons given in the protocol why it's legitimate for Article 16 to be invoked, which is one of the things about the protocol is that because the protocol is a result of a negotiation, it is at sometimes contradictory, if you see what I mean, because you often hear people on the EU side saying, well, supply chain should just reorient to deal with this. Yet the protocol itself says that trade diversion would be a reason why you could invoke Article 16. So the UK side is essentially saying, we are prepared to accept hybridity in Northern Ireland, so e.g. that you have both EU systems and UK systems. But we want those kind of running essentially on UK terms, which is what the argument about the European Court of Justice is. And I think the EU is very wary of that, because what they worry about is that will involve kind of seepage into the single market, but they won't have proper control over their external border. And I think the question is, can you find some way to strike a better balance than the protocol? The protocol is meant to both protect the integrity of the single market and respect the Good Friday Agreement. I think you can argue that at the moment it is overly weighted in favour of protecting the integrity of the single market, rather than the Good Friday Agreement, which obviously talks about east-west as well as north-south. And I think you could also argue that, although this is a word that creates a neuralgic reaction among lots of people in Brussels, but there is a case for more pragmatism, for accepting that, for example, going slightly further than the Sefcovic proposals and saying, look, whatever the UK does on food regulations, we are going to allow sausages to cross from Great Britain into Northern Ireland as long as they are going to kind of trusted traders, and they are clearly marked that they are not to be sold on into the Republic and therefore the EU single market. I mean, I personally think that if you did allow that, you would not suddenly see British sausages taking over the black market sausage factories. I think that is an unlikely concern. So I think the question is, can you strike that? But I think the issue is the UK, by putting the ECJ issue on the table, have basically forced everyone to focus on the fundamentals. And sometimes forcing everyone to focus on the fundamentals in a negotiation isn't actually conducive to getting to a negotiated outcome.
Ivan, if things were to go badly wrong in this negotiation, to what extent do you think the entire trade agreement between the UK and the EU is at stake?
Oh, I think it is, I'm afraid, at that point. Now, I agree with what James said, and there is a differentiation here, as I say, between the kind of the pragmatic needs of the greater, freer circulation of goods and much closer to the status quo anti-Brexit, and whether that is deliverable, building on what the Commission has so far proposed, which the British side is saying doesn't go far enough. I would be amazed at the pragmatic level if the Commission didn't have some more room for manoeuvre in their back pocket. But it crucially depends on whether that's the basis of the negotiation, and therefore you can scrabble around in sanitary and phytosanitary and customs issues and find a compromise, or whether it's really about governance, ECJ, and the role of EU law, and the risk from the British perspective that this thing drags Northern Ireland progressively into a different economic zone in perpetuity.
An even more serious conflict, though, could soon erupt in Asia. I'm joined now by Elbridge Colby, who worked at the Pentagon under Donald Trump and was the architect of the administration's defense strategy. In this week's magazine, he says the United States needs to be ready to go to war over Taiwan. He's the author of Strategy of Denial, American Defense in an Age of Great Power Conflict, and he joins me now. Bridge, thanks for joining Spectator TV. China has built models of U.S. warships in the desert for target practice and has tested using passenger ferries to transport troops and vehicles for an invasion of Taiwan. Joe Biden, meanwhile, says the U.S. will defend Taiwan if China invades. How likely is war over Taiwan?
Well, I think it's definitely possible, if not increasingly probable. I mean, there's, I think, three things going on. One is the Chinese clearly have the will to do something about it. I mean, they've wanted to bring Taiwan into the communist fold since this end of the Civil War. And it's also important for their regional and global ambitions because it's connected to the United States. And that's sort of the big problem for China, is to kind of break this coalition that's forming to blunt those ambitions. Secondly, they've now got much more of a way to do something about it. As you mentioned, Kate, they're doing mock-ups and target practice on American aircraft carriers, which tells you how serious they are. And they, of course, wanted that to be noticed. That's not the kind of thing you do if you want to remain hidden. The third thing that's going on is they may see a window of opportunity. The U.S. is finally, if too slowly and fitfully, turning to focus on Asia, and some of our military investments will start to pay off, but only later in the decade or into the next decade. And so China may see a window. And the other thing to remember, Kate, is that China has tried to bring Taiwan into the fold through peaceful means, coercion, gray zone tactics for many, many years, in fact, decades, and failed. And they know that. And so if they really want to do it, they're likely to look at the military instruments. So at some point, if the military balance doesn't go back in our favor, I think the question will be, why won't they, not why will they?
In your book, you say that Taiwan matters to China because it wants regional hegemony over Asia, meaning that it wants to be the undisputed dominant power. Can you explain why Taiwan is a key part of that?
Sure. Well, and the primary reason is that, for China to get to this regionally hegemonic position, it doesn't want to start a huge war Hitler-like with everybody all at the same time, which is it's likely to lose and would be extremely costly in any case. The key for China, rather, is to kind of break apart this aborting anti-hegemonic coalition, I call it, and this, Quad, AUKUS, all these different things that are happening, the US, India, Japan, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so how does China do that if it doesn't want to start World War, a total war? Well, it goes after those parts of the coalition that, in a way that would diminish or undermine confidence in that coalition, that people will basically not be defended. And to do that, it needs to go after the countries actually, paradoxically, that are connected to the United States. So think the best thing that ever happened in NATO after the Cold War was Russia going into Ukraine, because it indicated that Russia was afraid of NATO, right? That Ukraine wasn't in NATO. So that actually drove people towards NATO in the United States. So if China wants to actually, put a knife into the heart of that anti-hegemonic coalition, it's got to undermine people's confidence in America's willingness to effectively defend them. And Taiwan is connected to the United States. I think, as you point out, the president and others have indicated that we have a rock solid commitment to Taiwan. It's based on decades of behavior and so forth. And so actually China does have an interest in seizing Taiwan for a variety of reasons, and then presenting the United States with just a really difficult problem to reverse. And then people will say, can we really trust the Americans? And that could cause a run on the bank. And if they don't do it with Taiwan, they might not have to do it that many more times before people really lose confidence.
And as you say, on the flip side, it's America's goal to stop China from achieving this hegemony over Asia. In the current balance, who's winning?
Well, I mean, the question of a balance is much more sort of focused and localized than people often appreciate. Because China's best strategy is to go after Taiwan and then kind of reset the board, we're losing in that particular context. Basically, senior military officials are saying that when they do war games, we don't do well. In fact, we lose. We kind of know what to do about it, but we're not doing anything about it. So the fact that the United States still has a larger, economy and market exchange terms is not really the most important issue, because the contest is going to be settled in Asia. Pay tribute to Winston Churchill here. The key logic here is if we get things right in the decisive theater, we can put everything right afterwards, again. But the reverse doesn't hold true. And the thing is that the military balance and the power balance is not going in the right direction in Asia. And that's something that we really need to focus on rectifying immediately and urgently.
And you write in this week's magazine that the U.S. needs to build a coalition in the region that's stronger than China. Who would be part of that coalition?
Sure. Well, the cornerstones are Japan and India. They're the kind of the major powers that are sort of a second tier that are immediately threatened by China. Obviously, countries that for various reasons are opposed to China. Basically, they want to maintain their independence and autonomy. Australia, Taiwan, possibly South Korea, possibly Vietnam. It's going to be kind of a patchwork of countries that the primary cohesive aspect is going to be their shared opposition to being dominated by China, not what their political form of government is, not what their religion is, not what language they speak. So that's going to be the main draw. The key thing is that, again, it's going to be about that regional balance. It's primarily going to be Asian countries that are going to matter because they have the skin in the game and they have the military and economic power in the region where things are going to be decided.
And to what extent does this coalition need to grow or strengthen? Because some of the countries you just listed there, most of them, these are strong allies of the United States already. So how does it further cement its relationship to build up that stance against China?
Sure. Well, the paradox is we got to avoid two polar risks. One is undercommitting, having too few countries, as you suggest. The other is overcommitting. We don't want to get into a repeat of the Vietnam War where we go too far and we end up in wars we probably don't really need to fight. So the thing is, yes, I think you're right that we need to build a coalition that's expansive. We want the countries that are involved, certainly ones that we, the Americans, are specifically connected to be defensible. And that basically means islands. I mean, it's simple, but United States, Great Britain, traditionally better at naval, aerospace, high technology warfare. That's where we don't want to get drawn onto the Asian mainland if we can possibly avoid it, to countries that can't defend themselves like India. So I think that's what we're going to need to look at. Something that's often unappreciated in the Taiwan context is that if we lose Taiwan, we will have to dramatically compensate, both in pure power terms. Taiwan is a large economy. It's got a significant, power position, but it's also, people are really going to question our credibility. So we're going to have to add a lot more countries to our effort, and that's going to create new vulnerabilities that people don't adequately appreciate.
If the United States and its allies were to win a conflict in Taiwan, you write about increasing the burden of escalation. That is, persuading China that a small conflict over Taiwan shouldn't become a large-scale war. How do you persuade Beijing, fearing a wider decline, not to lash out?
Well, I don't want to minimize what the war over Taiwan would be. It would be a large-scale war, but I think it would not necessarily become a total war, which is a possibility. We can't be sure what would happen. But we'd have to be prepared for a limited war, because if China's prepared for a limited war and we're not, we will always be checkmated, because they'll be willing to take risk that we won't also be willing to do. The key there is not only the burden of escalation is not only about the costs that we can impose, so the fact that China will induce the United States and others to impose more costs on them. It's also about China having a sort of a graceful exit, a reason to acknowledge, if not defeat, frustration. I mean, the example I make, and it's not a great one, but it's satisfactory, is the situation on the Korean Peninsula since 1953. There's no peace agreement. It's still an armistice, but that's been satisfactory for us and South Korea, which is obviously a marvel of development and so forth. So I think what we will need to think about in this context actually is not only what are the costs and penalties we can impose on China, but what are the reasons China will have to sort of point to as positives in terminating a war, even if implicitly rather than explicitly.
Last question to you, Bridge. How does this potential conflict with China in the coming months and years measure up against other things like Russian aggression or Iran's nuclear ambitions, other problems that the West faces?
Sure. Well, I think it's important to be very clear. And one of the problems I have with the current administration is I don't think they're being clear with our European and Middle Eastern partners. I mean, look, the fundamental reality from an American point of view, I think objectively, is Asia is by far the most important theater of the world. It's going to be about 50% of global GDP, and that fraction is growing. And by far the most significant other power in the international system is China. It's far, far more consequential than Russia. Russia is a threat to NATO, and NATO is an important interest, but it pales in significance to Asia, which is roughly double of Europe's share of GDP and actually relatively increasing. So if the United States is pressed into making a decision, which current European behavior, not that of the United Kingdom, but of others like Germany, is essentially going to force the United States to make a choice. Because the reality is that we have, for a number of years, we have not had a military that is sufficiently large to fight two major power wars with China and Russia. So if we think about that as a practical consequence, not only if China goes first, will we have to focus on Asia, but in my view, even if Russia goes first in Europe, we should withhold military capacity to deter a Chinese attack on Taiwan or another ally in the Western Pacific. So this is going to leave a major vacuum in Europe. I mean, that's the fundamental reality, which I would rather that this not be the case. But there's also a very natural way to plug this gap, which is that the members of European NATO and close to it, like the Finns and the Swedes, far outweigh Russia in GDP terms and latent military power as well. So they can plug the gap. And many of them are. The United Kingdom deserves enormous credit for raising its defense spending during the pandemic. The Poles are spending a lot on defense and highly capable defensive forces. The big problem is basically Germany. And I think all European and North American states need to bring intense and searching pressure on the Federal Republic to do its part. I mean, nobody benefited more from collective defense than West Germany, and indeed a unified Germany. And now they are fundamentally shirking their responsibilities in a way that I think is unconscionable. But forget about unconscionable. I don't think it's in their interests over time, because if they do allow this vacuum and the Russians see an opportunity, they might act. And in that context, I don't think the United States will be there to save their bacon. And so I hope the Europeans will step up.
But not everybody agrees Taiwan is strategically important. I'm joined now by Emma Ashford, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and a columnist for foreign policy. Emma, we've heard from Elbridge Colby there, who thinks the US needs to get serious about preparing for a war with Taiwan. Do you agree?
I think that Elbridge Colby has some great ideas. I think he really understands security dynamics in Asia, but I do think that there are some serious flaws in his arguments, and I think he overlooks some of the serious risks to US security and prosperity that could come about if we actually followed his advice.
Up until now, U.S. policy towards Taiwan has been strategically ambiguous, but Joe Biden is being increasingly clear that the U.S. will defend Taiwan in the event of an invasion. What do you make of this strategy? Do you think that's actually ramping things up, or do you think that's making very clear to China, which may be a country not actually prepared to go to war, that it needs to back down on the aggressive moves that it's been making, certainly in terms of showing off its military might?
So there's some ambiguity in the administration's position too. Joe Biden has, as you say, made a couple of comments, we're obligated to defend Taiwan, and then the administration has walked those back pretty quickly through the Pentagon spokesperson and other officials. And so the official US policy is still ambiguity. And I think it's important to remember, that ambiguity has some benefits for the US. In particular, one I'd highlight is that it also allows us to keep a handle on Taiwanese nationalism. So one of the reasons why Taiwan has never actually declared itself a country is because of the ambiguity of that US commitment. So in keeping our stance ambiguous, as we have done since the 70s, we keep both sides, the Chinese from escalating and the Taiwanese from escalating that conflict in a way that we don't want. And so I worry that a more concrete commitment would just sort of give Taiwan a reason to escalate this as well, and then we would have escalation on both sides.
I suppose the argument goes that you can't stay in a limbo forever, and the COVID crisis exacerbated that, especially when Taiwan was being kept out of key decisions and key meetings being held by the WHO, for example, around the spread of the pandemic.
I'm not sure why we couldn't keep that status quo going. It has, as I say, served us well for almost 5 decades. And I think, the argument that we're having about whether to offer a more concrete commitment to Taiwan, it sounds great in theory, right? It's rhetorically, we're going to defend a democracy. We're going to defend them against Chinese aggression. We're offering them a commitment that would be comparable to the one we offer to our NATO allies. But again, that downplays the associated costs, right? It obligates us to go to war if the Chinese were to try something against Taiwan. And, it doesn't even have to be sort of a full frontal military assault, right? There are lots of, what we used to call salami slicing during the Cold War. There's lots of things that China could do to call that commitment into question. And if we have made a concrete commitment, then US policymakers find our options are a lot more limited than they would be otherwise.
It does seem, however, with the creation of AUSUK, this coalition between Australia, the UK, and the US, that there is more appetite now, certainly here in the UK, but also in Washington, D.C., to be much more upfront about the pushback that China should expect to receive if it were to step over certain red lines.
I think that's true. And to be clear, just because I'm arguing that we shouldn't give a concrete security commitment to Taiwan, it doesn't mean that I don't think that a rising China is somewhat of a threat to the US. It doesn't mean that I'm not worried about Chinese advances in Asia. But Taiwan is a very small piece of that overall puzzle. There are major countries in the region that the US is already aligned with, Japan and South Korea, that we're allied with. There are a variety of small, diverse countries in Southeast Asia. There's the whole Indian subcontinent that we can work with. And as you say, the Indians, the Australians, there are lots of countries that the US can work with that are more important than Taiwan. And so I'm not arguing that we shouldn't be pushing back against China. I'm not arguing that we shouldn't be concerned about China. I'm just saying I don't think that Taiwan is the place that the US should be making that, as you say, red line.
Emma, lastly, where do you think that this power rivalry is headed with China? Towards conflict, or do you think there's a possibility we're actually moving towards more competition?
Well, I mean, I don't know. And I think anyone that tells you otherwise is lying. But you know, I'll tell you sort of the both answers. So one is that, you know, we live in a fundamentally different era than the era prior to World War II, and that is because of nuclear weapons, right? And that may make conflict between the great powers less likely. But no one's very sure of that, right? We don't have a lot of historical evidence. We don't have cases to draw from. So that is basically a wager that we might not expect conflict. And sort of the other option is that conflict is very possible. And if you read Elbridge Colby's book, he argues that, you know, because China is rising, it's going to want Asian hegemony, it's going to try and push the US out of the region, and, you know, war in that situation, I think, is likely. Even if you don't agree with him that China is this, you know, assertive, aggressive, revisionist power, we know from history that there's always the risk of miscalculation, misperception, security spirals that accidentally turn into a conflict. You know, everything from, you know, World War I to much smaller conflicts have been caused by these factors. And so I think, you know, we should be aware that war is a possibility, but the answer probably isn't to just start building up our military and expecting a war, because that could become a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Finally, the Israeli ambassador to the UK, Tzipi Hotovely, was hounded by protesters after she attended a debate at the London School of Economics. Take a look. Why did they want the ambassador silenced? She joins me now to discuss. Ambassador, thanks so much for joining Spectator TV. First, can you give us your account of what happened at LSE?
Sure. Students in LSE invited me to give a lecture about Israel, and I gave a lecture in LSE, which was excellent. And what was excellent basically was the dialogue, the opportunity for the students to ask me questions. Some of them were challenging, and to have open dialogue with the young generation here on campus is one of my main goals. And I want to say that, from my opinion, the fact that there were protesters outside that were trying to prevent the legitimate right of every person, definitely ambassador of a friendly country and a democratic country like Israel, to just, you know, change views in campus is something that is outrageous, and it shouldn't have happened. And of course, everyone can criticize or protest, but not in a violent way, not by saying horrible things about hurting me and my car, like some people published on social media. And I'm very proud of the fact that the British government was so clear with you know, condemning the people that are using violence in order to intimidate representatives of a democratic country. And I think it's very clear that we're not intimidated, and we are going to go everywhere, and Israel is going to be making the message and the voice of the Israeli people, because this is my job as ambassador.
Ambassador, attempts to intimidate you, threats of violence, do you get this a lot?
During the military operation in Gaza, unfortunately, there were many violent actions. And they're the same people that were burning Israeli flags in front of the embassy, the people that were coming with convoys in my neighborhood, calling anti-Semite statements in the streets. They're basically coming from the same mindset. And I'm saying again, the British government made it clear. I mean, I got a phone call from Home Secretary yesterday. She said that this is unacceptable. The fact that they were trying to cancel my lecture, or they were trying to make the university doesn't feel comfortable with the fact that ambassador is coming. Look, this is something that no other ambassador experienced in the UK. Think about it. There's so many ambassadors here. Many countries that the UK can speak about, you know, different mindset of ideologies. Countries like China, countries like Iran, but you will never see the same aggression against those ambassadors. And of course, I'm against any kind of violence. I'm here for a dialogue. But think about it. Why should a democratic country, the only democratic country in the Middle East, will have this kind of, I would say, a violent, aggressive outreach from students, when all I want to do is to speak and to have a dialogue with the students. This is unacceptable.
What did you make of the fact that this incident in LSE took place on the 83rd anniversary of the Kristallnacht, where more than 90 Jews were killed in Nazi Germany?
I think there is no connection between the horrible history of Germany and what is happening in this country, because in this country the government is so strict about fighting anti-Semitism and definitely gives all the protection that I need. I'm surrounded by British protection, wonderful people. My protection team is doing everything in order to make sure that I will do my work everywhere, and they never prevent anything that is about a public stage to happen. So I'm definitely thankful and grateful for the fact that this country understands where the red line crosses and what is legitimate and something that is unlegitimate, like preventing or silencing ambassadors.
You say that you're very grateful to the UK government for the way that they've supported you, that broadly speaking it was a very good debate where there was, I'm sure, very fierce debate and rigorous analysis of your comments. But then on the other side, you say that you often feel singled out as far as ambassadors go because you are representing the State of Israel. How do you weigh this up in the way that you interpret the UK? Do you consider this to be an open and tolerant country?
Absolutely. I think that those radicals are minority. They're a vocal minority. They definitely don't represent the majority, not of the students, definitely not the people of this country. And I think this is how we need to take care of it as a minority. And this is something that it's very clear for me since I arrived that the UK is very happy to do bilateral cooperations with Israel. I can see that with the meeting that we held just last week in COP26 between our prime ministers. Prime Minister Bennett went to COP, and we had the second large delegation here. And Prime Minister Johnson and Prime Minister Bennett had excellent meeting. So you can see the bilateral cooperation is just growing, and the relationship is great. So we shouldn't let those voices of radicals to interrupt the legitimate dialogue that every ambassador should hold with all parts of British society.
Are you going to change the way that you attend or speak at universities in the future based on what happened at LSE this week?
Absolutely not. I'm going to attend to every single lecture of important campus in this country, and this country has many, many important academic institutions that you should be very proud of, but you should also make sure that freedom of the whole concept of universities is exchanging views and the ability to have free speech everywhere. And I think that the government is definitely doing its best to make the right atmosphere on campus, but the radicals shouldn't shape the discourse. It's actually the people that care about the future of this country should make sure that every student should feel free to feel comfortable on campus. Some students said they were really intimidated from the sounds they heard from the protesters. They were shouting and screaming and trying to intimidate the students. So I think this kind of atmosphere is not a good thing in campus. Campus should be free, and campus should be open-minded to a dialogue.
Last question, Ambassador. From your perspective, what was the divide amongst the protesters? Because, of course, the right to protest is a crucial part of the right to free speech, but what seemed to happen earlier this week was that delicate balance flipped from protesting to some real aggression that you experienced. Was the whole crowd like that, or were these, again, individuals amongst those who were politely or at least calmly protesting?
Well, it's the police job to make the decision who was crossing lines and who was, doing things against the law. But from my perspective, I can only tell you my experience as an ambassador, that we heard about a big pressure to cancel the lecture. And those people, again, some of them are part of, the Palestinian groups on campus. They don't want the voice of Israel to be heard. I never, as an ambassador, said, don't listen to someone. I think every sound, definitely of people that are being invited by the students, should be sound on campus. And I think the fact they're trying to create delegitimation of a democratic country that is a strong ally of the UK, this is the problem. And again, they were trying to delegitimize the lecture. delegitimize the voice of Israel on campus. And I'm very glad that the message of the University of LSE was, we will never accept silencing a legitimate voice. And I was giving the lecture. It was an hour and a half of a very nice and very interesting dialogue.
Ambassador, thanks for joining me. That's it for this week. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe to the Spectator's YouTube channel. Just click the button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon to make sure you never miss an episode. Thanks for watching, and do join us again next week.